Hiya, everyone. My name's Professor Stephen Rowley. I'm the director of the Curtin Research Centre, and welcome to Meeting Room 1 in beautiful Burloo. The weather has put on a good show for you today. I'm delighted to welcome you to the session on neighbourhood planning in an era of densification. This is particularly interesting, I think, to our Western Australian listeners, where we've not done very well in this space at all. So it'd be great to learn from examples from other states. But given the government's focus on well-located supply, the densification of our existing neighbourhoods is essential. But how do we do it well? How do we deliver a broad range of housing options, and how do we ensure that developing our neighbourhoods are of high quality but also affordable? So to unpack these complex issues, we have three speakers today, and then we will have a Q&A session. Firstly, we have Leanne Hodyl from Hodyl Consultants. Then we have Jessie Taylor from Mission Australia, and we have Kylie Williams from Economic Development Queensland. You can read the bios in the actual conference program. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a precisely 7 to 9 minute presentation from each of the three presenters. After that, we'll have a little chat on stage, and then we'll open up to the audience for your questions. So please do think about questions as we go along. But firstly, I'd like to invite Leanne to the stage to share her presentation.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks everyone for coming to this session. It's going to be the best of the concurrent sessions, so you made a good choice. My name's Leanne Hodyl. I'm an urban designer and an urban strategist, and I particularly work at the intersection of design and policy, so a lot of in a planning space. I have been a consultant for the past 10 years, but I've also had experience working in government at the City of Melbourne, including writing their housing strategy back in 2014. And this is my first housing conference, so I'm quite excited to be here. My consultancy is focused on the public interest outcomes, and I frame that around, talk about that in designing and planning for the city that we share. It's a big topic today, I think, talking about densification and neighbourhood planning. It's obviously a hot topic. I thought the best way to access this question, and coming from a Victorian perspective and trying to share a Victorian perspective, was to talk about the Activity Centre program that's currently being implemented across Melbourne. So to put this in some context, because I think this helps, is what the slide here shows is just a bit of the context of what's been happening in Victoria for the past 25 years. And so it shows you that really back from the sort of 2000s to 2015, and this won't be a surprise to many people, it was obviously Australia-wide as well, there was really a reform process which I've sort of framed around let it go and around deregulation. And so some of the things that happened back then, we're still dealing with the ramifications of that now. And that includes things like the removal of density controls, so floor space ratio controls or floor area ratio controls, a shift to a performance-based system instead of more prescriptive controls. And things happened like the rezoning of Fisherman's Bend, which is 250 hectares, which got rezoned overnight with no plan and no funding. We then moved into a much, I think, healthier space, which I kind of call, the reform was focused around this concept of what I call repair. So we actually started to fix some of that damage, and we started to have better policy in place, things like better apartment design standards, and I won't read through those other ones. Then, of course, so I think we're on a pretty good roll, and we're actually getting some really good traction with some better planning policy around densifying our neighbourhoods. COVID hit, obviously that came with its major, significant challenges, but particularly from a planning point of view, inflation obviously was a challenge, and obviously for me, what I thought was going to be a positive was a shift to what healthier homes look like, but unfortunately I think we've lost that focus now with the sort of broader housing crisis. And now we've shifted to the last couple of years, which I've sort of framed as crash through, and this is, from what I understand, talking to many others working in other states, quite universal to what's going on in Australia at the moment, that need to really act fast, which I'm not challenging that, but we still need to act well. And so this is a quick short list of some of the things that are going on in Victoria. And one of those is the Activity Centre program, which I'm going to talk about further. But just to quickly point out, this is probably the most significant reform we've had in the state, definitely since sort of, I think, the 90s and the Planning Act and all the controls were rewritten. So the This slide here shows you what was happening in the sort of last the years through that deregulation. This is a Moonee Ponds Activity Centre, which is about 9 kilometres outside of the CBD of Melbourne. You can see in the photo on the bottom left there, it's a sort of a classic Melbourne high street, 2 stories. It's a really fantastic community hub, and it's quite a lively centre. The impacts of deregulation, we were getting significant applications for planning approvals which were far above the planning controls. There was then, as I just sort of walked you through, a bit of a shift where there was an attempt to arrest that, and I think we're heading in a good direction. But what was happening is because we had no fixed policy, we were getting buildings particularly that were taller than the planning controls were allowed for. But more importantly, I think they were also a lot denser, and they didn't come with any other infrastructure planning. So that was just one example, and that was being led by local governments, and it traditionally has been led by local governments, all of this local area planning. But to fast forward then back to today and what's happening now, we've got a state-led program for activity centre zones. It's either called the Activity Centre Program or the Train and Tram Zones Program, and this is the Melbourne map of the transport network, and the program included 10 pilot centres that were led by the state government, together with local governments as well, where new controls were put in place to accelerate housing supply. That program has now been expanded to 50 centres. Literally a few weeks ago, new plans were released for those centres, but all that they show is heights. So there's no kind of comprehensive planning released, but the councils and the local communities have been asked to respond to these plans, which are focused on heights. They also come with, and this is the scale, hopefully indicates the scale of transformation, they come with new tools. So the first one is a built form overlay tool, which is focused on what they're calling the activity centre core. And then outside of that, and this is probably one of the most radical shifts in, I think, Melbourne, if it works, to be frank, is they're looking to rezone significant catchment areas outside what are the traditional activity centres. So the activity centres might be areas where there's currently 2, 4, 6-storey buildings, where there's proposals for now 10 up to 20-storey buildings. But in these catchment areas, so these lighter grey areas, lighter purple areas here, they're basically detached housing almost everywhere. And the shift there is to take them to 4 storeys or 6 storeys if the site size is over 1,000 square metres. And there have been controls that have been implemented and fast-tracked through the process and that have now been rolled out and are being put in place. There are some major challenges in this, obviously, about how to do this well. The question of transition, I think, is going to need a lot more debate and discussion, but also some really basic mechanical questions. How do you get site consolidation? Why would someone sell their house to a developer to build 4 storeys when they can already sell their house for probably $1.5 million, and it's a lot easier? So my snapshot summary, I guess, about what's happening in this activity centre program, and this is then talking to the broader, I guess, context for how we should be thinking about, I think, neighbourhood planning, is what's good in these programs is it's bold. We need reform. The planning system hasn't been delivering adequately. The 70% infill target, I think, is a really good target. It's ambitious and it's being backed by this program, which is great. And these centres are all on locations with good access to jobs and transport. It's also addressing some of the NIMBYism that has been occurring in some of these centres, which has been resisting change. It's looking to be simpler, and in a couple of these centres, there's been a reintroduction of density controls, floor area ratio controls, to try and manage land speculation and deliver better quality. There are a number of things which I think are too soon to say. I'm a natural optimist. No, I should say I was a natural optimist. I think until a couple of years ago I was an optimist. Now I'm being worn down. But I think that, there are too soon to say, will the housing actually be delivered? As we all know in this room, some of the challenges for delivering housing is not planning. It's construction costs, it's access to labour, it's interest rates and so on. And so just flipping the controls and actually giving them a lot more height is not necessarily going to work. Some of the other challenges are around quality and livability. Will these deemed to control controls work? But then you can see here what I think is a long list of further work required, and top of that is social housing requirements, and others are going to talk to that further than me. So it's an ambitious program. It's being rolled out at pace. Councils have a few weeks to respond. It's really significant and transformative. There's a long list of things that I think there is further work required, but what I really wanted to just wrap up with is just talking about what I think is also missing in the conversation, which is this question of social licence. And I think the last 5 years we were actually trying to work to build social licence, but now that's being eroded again. And so that's about building legitimacy, credibility and trust in the program, which I think even the fact that it's working at such pace is going too fast. It's not going to happen. And lastly, I just shared this slide in as many of my presentations as I can because I love it so much. It's from the Copenhagen plan, and it sets targets for the delivery of their city plan. And what I love about these so much is it's both objective and subjective targets. So it doesn't just say we need, for example, canopy cover of 30%. It says a certain percentage of Copenhageners should feel safe. It says they should feel that the city has an edge and they're proud of it, or that they feel like they can access their community and be part of it. So I just think those questions about what this community wants, we need to build far more into our neighbourhood planning. Thanks.
Seamless transition.
Totally, so smooth. Thanks, Leanne. So I'm Jesse Taylor. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here today. Today I'm going to talk to you about a proposal for mandatory inclusionary zoning. It's a nationally consistent approach, and we'll just start. So mandatory inclusionary zoning, or MIZ, is a planning mechanism designed to help deliver equitable, diverse, and sustainable housing outcomes across Australia. Importantly, it doesn't require additional government funding. Instead, it leverages the existing planning system to ensure that new developments continue to contribute to long-term affordability by delivering housing where it's needed most, by ensuring that secure, affordable housing is built in perpetuity, and that it embeds affordable homes within mixed, inclusive communities. The MIZ framework is grounded in evidence. It's shaped by a cross-sector collaboration of more than 100 contributors from housing, planning, government, and community sector, and aligns with current national housing and affordability policy priorities. We would have heard this morning when we were talking about the Constellation project. We'll talk about that in a second, and that's where this is birthed out of. At its core, MIZ is a simple, scalable mechanism that uses planning to deliver housing equity. And it's designed for purpose. And let's see if this thing clicks. There we go. And so, what is MIZ? So MIZ is a planning mechanism that ensures a defined proportion of new residential developments is delivered as affordable housing. The national framework outlines a consistent approach across Australia and includes a minimum contribution benchmark of an agreed percentage for affordable housing delivered through on-site complete dwellings or land in lieu or financial contributions. And really ideally, its application is best placed in metropolitan areas and designated regional centers. We factored in a phased and grandfather implementation period, allowing jurisdictions and industry to stage adoption, manage viability, and minimize disruption. Clearly defined roles and responsibilities across levels of government and delivery agencies. All of this is aligned with the National Housing Accord, with state targets and local planning instruments, and ongoing monitoring evaluation is there to track delivery and impact. And the approach prioritizes transparency, consistency, and flexibility, enabling local adaptation within a nationally aligned framework. And MIZ has got a strong foundation. So from concept to consensus, the National MIZ initiative originated through the Constellation project, and that's a cross-sector collaboration that was led by Mission Australia, the Australian Red Cross, PwC, and the Centre for Social Impact. In response to the piecemeal and inconsistent use of inclusionary zoning across Australia, the project formed a MIZ steering committee, which was inclusive of housing providers, planners, economists, academics, and local and state government representatives. And over several years, the process included input from more than 100 different stakeholders, multiple national and state-based roundtables, as well as technical, legal, and policy advice from sector leaders. And in 2005, the work culminated in the release of the MIZ National Framework, now hosted on the website of the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness, and it presents a ready-to-implement roadmap for states and territories to embed MIS into its planning frameworks. And we know it works, and MIS is not a new idea. We were talking about it at the last Hodyl conference in 2023, and in fact, it's already delivering results in Australia and overseas. In South Australia, a 15% affordable housing target has been in place since 2005, resulting in thousands of delivered homes. In New South Wales, you have City West Housing with over 1,200 affordable homes delivered in inner city through planning agreements. In Victoria, negotiated inclusionary provision embedded within major urban renewal and precinct projects are underway. And internationally, in England, for instance, there was 1 year where you saw over 26,000 affordable homes in a single year be developed using a MIS-style mechanism. In New York City, in Vancouver, in New Jersey, it's all, they're looking at treating inclusionary zoning as a standard planning mechanism and tool for mixed and affordable housing. The framework draws from these lessons and is tailored to Australia's planning and housing environment. And in essence, it delivers equity, by locking in affordability and perpetuity, diversity by ensuring mixed tenure and inclusive communities, and certainty by creating a national standard for planning contributions. And we're moving it forward, and we want you to get involved. And so, how are we going to make this happen? Let's click this button. So momentum is growing. Did this work? No. Great. So for the first time, there's the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council has acknowledged the need for a national approach to inclusionary zoning to drive affordable housing outcomes. The modeling is underway right now. There's an economic analysis that's being delivered by SGS out of Melbourne. And that's been commissioned through it's been independently commissioned through the MIS Steering Committee, and that is in place to quantify the housing yield, the market impact, and regional variations of the MIS framework, with results expected in the very near future, this year. There's cross-sector support, and that keeps growing through philanthropic, housing, planning, and advocacy stakeholders joining the MIS Campaign Committee. Key local councils, CHPs, funders, and community organizations are actively endorsing the framework. And there's a fresh campaign that we're working on launching, and we're updating a MIS website. And so that's where I ask you to pick up your phones and point to your camera at the QR code, and you can go to the mis.au website. You can download the framework proposal. You can link in to receive more information. And we'll be providing through the site support for education, opportunities for endorsement, for advocacy, for stakeholder logos, case studies, and implementing resources, all in the short future, in the very near future. And so, in essence, what we want to do here today with you is, is a call to action. That if you believe that planning policy can help address inequality, if you believe that every development should contribute to the solution, then we ask you to join us and visit the website to read the framework, to endorse the vision as an individual or organization, and help make MIS part of the national housing solution. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Kylie Williams. I'm from Economic Development Queensland. So we've come a long way. And if you were in the session just before lunch, you may have heard my colleague Heather talk about our organisation. I thought what I'd just do is, because many of you may not know us, is just give some information around Economic Development Queensland. So that will help you, I suppose, focus your questions during the Q&A session around what you would like to ask me. So, who is Economic Development Queensland? We are out of Queensland. We are a statutory authority. We are part of the Queensland Government. We have been around in some form since 2007. So I have been in and out of the organisation since 2007. So I bring a lot of experience around the different methodologies and techniques and levers we have used to deliver housing throughout the state. And we do operate throughout the state. We, as Heather was explaining, we are the Queensland Government's development agency. Our focus over time changes with the aspirations of the Queensland Government. We are very much focused at this point in time on supply, at scale and at pace. Oh, wrong one. So we are about unlocking land for development. We are not operating as a developer at this point in time, although we have in times past. So we have that experience that we bring to our I suppose, process. We mainly deliver in areas called priority development areas, and I'll touch on those a little bit later, but we do also operate outside of those areas. We are looking at how we can deliver more land that is ready for development and create greater development certainty and improve our efficiency, service delivery and our customer engagement. I keep pressing the wrong button. So EDQ has various roles. I'm in the planning area, Heather is more in the development delivery area and development focus, but we have a wide range of skill sets within our organisation, and really what we seek to do is bring all of those skill sets to help us deliver at scale and at pace, housing and non-housing development throughout the state. So we do strategic planning, strategic land use and infrastructure planning. We do the development assessment when those applications are brought forward. We do site master planning, we act as precinct master developer in certain circumstances. We do both do the planning and then the funding and the delivery of the infrastructure that is necessary to underpin those development areas. We have the fortune and sometimes the curse of administering large sums of grant money and loan money on behalf of the Queensland Government. Just recently, the Queensland Government gave us $150 million to administer in a PDA called Warraba, which is Caboolture West, for those people who are familiar with Brisbane. $150 million is a lot of money. It won't go far enough to cover all the infrastructure necessary to bring on that area for 25,000 dwellings. So we need to work out how do we make that money go as far as it can to deliver the infrastructure required to support that community. And because at this stage it is a loan, how do we then get that money back into the Queensland coffers so that it can be used to leverage the next community and the next community that needs to be funded with infrastructure? We also have a section of our organisation that does industrial land development. They've been around the Queensland Government since the 70s. They're very successful. They're probably the only successful industrial land developer in Queensland over that period of time, and they deliver a lot of our industrial estates in Queensland. As I said, we predominantly work in areas called priority development areas, of which there has been 39 declared across the state since 2008, when the first two were declared. We have had one PDA revoked, and that was around the Moranbah township in regional Queensland. Of those, once the area is declared a PDA, the local government no longer does the planning and the development assessment for those areas, and instead they come to the state. In the first instance, they all go to our Minister as the Minister for Economic Development Queensland, and then they're delegated. 29 of those PDAs have been delegated to EDQ, and that's in areas close to the city. We've got the Queen's Wharf development as a PDA. We have Hurston, which is the RBH hospital, as a PDA. We have airports, we have urban areas, we have greenfield areas, we have brownfield sites, we have excess state land that's all been declared PDAs, and EDQ manages 29 of those directly. They cover about 20,000 hectares, and they are planned to deliver about 250,000 dwellings between now and 2060. What I wanted to touch on just to round out my presentation was just some of the key challenges that we are currently facing, which none of these will come as a surprise to anyone in this room who's involved in planning and development. Obviously, one of the biggest issues we've got is we deliver transformational change in these PDAs. And so what we are constantly trying to manage is the existing values and aspirations of the existing community in those areas with what we'd like to provide for the new communities coming in. And often they're very different. The people have been in that community, have invested in that community, they're concerned about the change that we will bring about. So we have to manage that. I've talked about the cost of infrastructure, but there's also the timing of that infrastructure. Obviously, everyone wants everything at the beginning of the process, and that's a very hard thing for us to deliver, both from a construction perspective and also a monetary perspective. Market conditions really do affect every decision we make in PDAs. What can we bring online? When can we bring online? Who will live here? What will their needs be? The other thing we often find is the competing interests of the governments, whether that's local government, the community, and the developers, and then at the state level we have all the state agencies coming to us to say this is what we need to deliver in this area. We need schools, we need hospitals, we need roads, we need swimming pools, we need stadiums, whatever we might need, and that becomes a really difficult thing for us to juggle in those areas. And then we have the federal overlays, which we're trying to turn on housing, but there are obstacles from the federal level with how we manage their interests as well.
Thank you. Beautifully timed. We've now got an hour for questions, so we'll try and keep it going for that period of time. I'll start with you, Leanne. I'm going to ask a couple of questions of each of our presenters before turning it up over to the audience, so you've got plenty of time to think about it. These are not ones that have been prepared in advance, I have to add. I've just so forgive me if I make a bit of a mess of them. But Leanne, so you talked, and I think this will come out in our plenary session at 4 o'clock, about the factors outside of planning which are a barrier to supply and the importance of the private sector. So what was the reaction of the private sector to these sort of sweeping reforms over the last couple of years?
I think a lot of it's being driven by the private sector and by the development community for good reasons, because they're trying to obviously present themselves as part of the solution and present supply as the answer. So I think that broadly they've been supported by the private development sector. I think part of the challenge is that, and one of the, I guess the key messages that I'm trying to deliver to local government or state government who I'm working with through this program as well, is just switching the controls doesn't necessarily deliver the supply, and I think they're relying on that. And so I think while the private sector is supportive, we're trying to then make that a more nuanced position, or to ask them to probe harder into that, to say, but is it the speculative developers who are supportive, or the developers who are actually going to deliver the housing that are supportive, and just push a bit harder.
Is there an understanding within government about the nature of developers and the complexity of land ownership and how the actual industry all fits together? Because I get the sense of governments around the country that there is a bit of a misunderstanding of how the industry actually works.
I think there is a misunderstanding, or I think perhaps it's patchy is a kind of maybe a better way of saying it. I think there's some who do understand it, and perhaps they've come from that background, but I think historically they haven't. They've come from more traditional, say, planning background or so on. I know when I've done some research overseas, talking to other cities when they've moved into this particularly accelerated or perhaps pressured environment of needing the market to deliver, the local councils themselves have had to upskill in that area. They've had to actually hire in people who do have development negotiation skills, or who've come from the real estate industry. And I think one of the key challenges and one of the key messages that I've been putting back to this into this program, I guess, is they need to understand land economics. They can't just understand this. I spend way too many meetings talking about building setbacks. Oh my God. Which is important, don't get me wrong. It's really important, from daylight and sunlight and livability. But we should be having tougher conversations to understand land economics, because that's actually what's going to make it happen on it.
And that leads in beautifully to mandatory inclusionary zoning. So when I came to Australia 20 years ago, it came from a background of working on Section 106 agreements in the UK, and I had the task for government of valuing the Section 106 affordable housing obligation contributions, which was challenging. But it was delivering, as you said, Jessie, a very high number of affordable housing dwellings, around 60% at one point, varying with market conditions. But the original policy was introduced in the late 1980s and really started to be effective around the late 90s. But clearly, when you talked about your 2005 document, this has been an ongoing conversation for many, many years in this country. So have you seen attitudes from the development industry in particular change over the last sort of 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Yeah, over the years, I think that the development sector is recognizing that they have a part to play in helping to solve the housing crisis, and I think being able to position themselves so that they're accepting of a pipeline in perpetuity of affordable rentals mean that working with the community housing provider sector as well as coming around the table when we're doing our economic modeling, has been quite beneficial, I think, in their view, so that when the modeling from SGS does come out in the very near future, like, they're not surprised, they can get behind it and they can support it, and they've been part of the process the entire way. Because I think, like, ultimately, if they're building and, we say, oh, we just need more supply, it's not that simple, that we do need more affordable supply. And I think the attitudes, to go back to your question, they are shifting and they are coming around. And I think it's best displayed from what I can see from people coming around the table to talk about the impact of MIS across the development sector.
Because the pushback has always been about the feasibility of developments. We cannot afford to provide affordable housing. It will mean that the whole development will fall over. But do you sense now that the conversation has shifted a little bit towards, well, yeah, we understand it will have some feasibility impact, but the actual need to deliver affordable housing is now so important we need to find ways around that?
And it's critical, and we need to partner with the right organizations in order to enable that. And I think that's where the community housing provider sector comes in. I think talking to the economics behind what we're doing, just briefly, I think we acknowledge that it's the land value which will absorb the cost of MIS, and just getting our mind around how mandatory inclusionary zoning rolls out across the different capital environments where land value has significantly increased, or even inside of specific regional centers, that gives us the opportunity to implement MIS.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is critically underplayed in conversations, and hopefully we'll hear about it this afternoon, the role of the landowner and the expectations of the landowner and how that actually feeds through into feasibility and the prices that developers actually want to charge to maximise the amount they can pay for the land. It's a messed up system, I have to say, but if you really want to have a crack at delivering supply, well, let's have a crack at the landowners. But that's maybe not for today. Moving on to Kylie. So you've been in and out of Economic Development Queensland for, what, almost 20 years now. What have you seen that's been the most effective levers to deliver social and affordable housing, but also to deliver density well?
Thank you. We have got a lot of experience using different levers to deliver affordable and social housing. But if I just concentrate on the affordable housing, I think the lesson that I have learned is that every housing estate we go into, so every PDA, we need to understand its context, understand what has already been the aspiration set through the development controls for that area, what point in the cycle are we, what point in the financial situation of the people who need to live in those areas, what does that look like, and then understand how do we tailor a response to deliver supply, but also to drive affordability. Obviously, through social housing, we can work with our housing colleagues in the Department of Housing to deliver that, and it is, as was mentioned before lunch, it is more difficult when you get in the high density areas because you are looking at group title development, and that's really difficult to get it protected through those communities. It's easier if we're out in greenfield areas, but where we have got density, we need to work out what we can actually deliver in that location, given construction prices, what's the market cycle doing, what are developers thinking, what are they trying to deliver, is it 1 or 2 bedroom? We've got lots of experience, every one of them is unique, and we can't take the model that was used in one PDA and just keep transferring across to different PDAs. So every time we go in, we look to see what we should deliver. Is it affordable through subsidy? Is it affordable by design? Is it 5%? Is it 0 at this point in time? Is it 10%? And we've got models going from 5% up to 25% for affordable, looking at subsidies and affordable by design.
And again, I think there are lessons to be learned for inclusionary zoning policies there, that a one-size-fits-all model just doesn't work. It's not going to work on all sites, and that economic analysis underpinned by housing need analysis as well is really important. But can I ask, in PDA areas, how does the public consultation work? Because you've sort of taken the powers away from local government, and you're not alone around Australia in doing that. So how does that consultation work?
Yes, that's another very good question. There is statutory requirements for us to consult on a development scheme. So we have a proposed development scheme. So after maybe a 12-month or an 18-month process of preparing that plan, in consultation with the local government, the state government, landowners, if they're community consultation specific to that area. It's also reflective of government position at the time. So we've got examples where we've been in and worked with the community for 18 months to prepare a development scheme, and then put it out for notification and got the worst reaction we've ever had to our development scheme. And I've watched BCC do the same thing, where they work significantly with the community. In other instances where we have worked very closely with the developers to try and understand what the opportunities, and then the council and then the elected representatives, we've been able to go up the scheme that, while of course there's some people in the community that may be directly affected, that may voice opposition to it, you get a lot of strong support from those people who would like to live in the area. So not necessarily the people living there now, but the people who would aspire to live in that area. And obviously over the last couple of years, we really tried to talk to the community to say, we understand that you've invested here, but where are your children going to live and where are your grandchildren going to live? And trying to convey the benefits of having supply delivered in this area for them and their families.
Similar question, Leanne, about public consultation around the activity centres.
Yeah, thanks. Because so there has been some consultation. There's been one round of consultation for each sort of centre at a high level, just to sort of understand the local community sort of sentiment for that place. And then, as I said, there's now a current round of consultation, which is just on effectively a plan that shows some building heights and these catchment areas. But I think what I'd love to, I guess, tease out a bit further too is this difference between public consultation and engagement and this concept of social licence, and that's why I sort of put it on the last slide, because I think if we accept we're operating in a moment of crisis, then there's some acceptance that I think from some people, many people, that you can sort of skip consultation or fast track consultation. But that's when I think social licence becomes even more important. And I think what's happening at the moment is, even if there's consultation, it's happening so fast or not at all, or misunderstood. Like, they don't understand they're being consulted on actually the fact that these controls are going to be put in place and they won't be able to object to any permits anymore. Like, it's in the fine print. And so they're not just only fast tracking the engagement or not doing it, they're losing social licence. And I think we need to shift that to say, okay, we might need to go fast and we might need to take some shortcuts on engagement, then we have to continue to build social licence somehow. And I think that's a slightly different question to how should we be engaging. And I think we have to be delivering something that's good. I think that's one of the biggest ways to deliver social licence. And I think that's where we haven't even really touched on perhaps some of whether this is going to deliver quality places to live as much. But I think that's what's going to happen, is they're going to potentially lose further social licence if the quality isn't good.
And that's what I wanted to bring it back to. The title of the session is Neighbourhood Planning in an Era of Densification. But what makes a good neighbourhood? What makes a dense neighbourhood where people want to actually live?
Yeah, well, I think we probably all know, in many ways, we all know the answers to that. And I think it comes back to the engagement question, because too often you go out and engage, it gets pulled together as some sort of pithy summary, and guess what? People want parks, and they want trees, and they want places where it's affordable for them to live, or their communities to live. And not to dismiss those things, they're such important things, but we need to get below that, and we need to get place-specific engagement to understand what's really specific to that community. It's interesting the way you're talking about it, because it sounds more place-based. And that's what generally was occurring in Victoria. This program is so different because they're trying to do it at scale, and so they're looking at 25 places at once. There's another 25 coming out, I think, in a few weeks. These communities don't necessarily even know they've been selected until that sort of comes out, because guess what? They're not all hanging out on planning websites like maybe I am. And so, yes, I think, so coming back to your question, doing it at that neighbourhood scale, it still will take some time. You have to still commit some time to doing that. But I think the opportunity of doing it at scale is they could be throwing more resources into more educational community material about what good looks like, why, for example, height isn't necessarily bad, because obviously that's such a trigger for everybody. I'd rather an 8-storey building with lots of canopy trees around it than a 6-storey building that covers the whole site and creates a hotter climate and has no windows, So I think what they could be doing better is building that social licence at scale still, but they still need to somehow come and talk to each community that can't avoid that.
And what about dwelling mix, maybe for you, Kylie, the mix of affordable, of public, of community plus marking, and also the actual dwelling composition? Again, is it very much depending on the local area and local need, or have you got the sort of a particular model that you employ to deliver those mixes?
There's a few questions there. Probably the first thing I'd just like to touch on is that our conversation around affordable has definitely changed. When we, as a founding organisation in 2007, started using the word affordable, I can tell you the community reaction was dreadful. We don't want those sorts of people here. We don't want that sort of housing here. And it was a really difficult conversation to have with the communities, and we had to work out, well, how do we explain what we're seeking to achieve without using words that are triggering really bad reactions in the community unnecessarily. So we started using terms like diversity of product size, diversity of price, diversity of tenure, to try and get around that so that we didn't, trigger the communities. And I don't know if the HC's here today, they will give you any number of examples of, when they advertised and just community reaction to that. What I have noticed in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly in Queensland, is that does not exist anymore. That stigma associated with, affordable housing, everybody is hurting. Everybody knows that we need to change the cost of our housing. It needs to be more reasonable. It needs to be more sustainable. The increase is not what we have been, some people have been aspiring to, 10% increases. So when we go into communities and we talk about trying to deliver housing that is affordable for their children and their grandchildren, and maybe their, single uncle to afford, they're much more reasonable and responsive to that. And while there is still some who may have $1 million, $1.5 million, $1,000 home on a rural residential block gets upset, the majority of people understand exactly what we're doing and realise that we need to be more moderate in our housing aspirations.
And Jessie, have you seen a great understanding from the private sector about what affordable housing actually means? There's always a stigma, particularly in the UK, about delivering public housing, but having a shared equity product is a lot more acceptable.
And integrated into developments, and so they don't they're not distinguishable from the other properties. They're all built to standard. Ideally they're well managed, and they really shouldn't have much of a what would you say, they shouldn't really stand out from any of the other properties and property owners that are cohabitating in that same place.
I remember speaking to what will be unnamed housing minister about inclusionary zoning and putting forward the case for it. And the response I got was, in the UK they just had separate entrances for the public housing tenants and for the market housing tenants, and they weren't allowed to use the gym and so forth. So that one example gets repeated over and over again as a reaction against inclusionary zoning, but it really doesn't work like that.
And there you go. I was just saying there's different approaches, and so peppering through developments, affordable housing, so you don't know where they are, I think lends itself to eradicating that sense of growing stigma that can be associated with mixed property dwellings.
I think one positive that's coming through all of this shake-up in Victoria and all the significant scale of planning reform is obviously it is drawing so much attention, whether it's getting people upset or people are really supportive, and it is actually, I think, driving a much stronger conversation about, well, what do you want your neighbourhood to be like? Who has the chance to live there? There are some really tough, great conversations that are flowing from this as well. And I think from a professional point of view, and working as an urban designer, and I was quite involved with the Urban Design Forum in Melbourne as well, even we had to sort of make sure we were shifting our message much more strongly and our advocacy to how do we create great neighbourhoods? How can this growth bring change? Trying to help people understand in the public what good change look like instead of resisting change. So I think they are really positive things that have come out of this, and I guess that's a classic, a crisis forces everyone to think a bit harder about something. And I think if we can keep harnessing that and hook in, why do we need diverse communities, not just the one you've got now? And I think the importance of inclusive communities, I think that can be a real positive out of this.
Okay, to the audience, do we have any questions? Question over there? Oh, great, lots of hands. So one over there. The microphone's on its way. If you just say who you are and ask a question, but try to keep it succinct. We don't want 5-minute statements and then a question at the end.
I do have many questions and a few statements, so I'm very sorry. I will try and keep it brief. I'm Jamie McCall. I'm from BHC. We have previously been great partners with EDQ, so thank you for that. Just for a bit of context, the Queensland Deputy Premier recently removed some of the affordable housing and social housing targets for the Woolloongabba PDA in particular and in other locations. And I think there's something particularly infuriating about the private sector weaponising the housing crisis as an argument for not delivering inclusionary zoning because it's too expensive. And I feel like we've lost a little bit of that argument. We're obviously not as persuasive as, say, the UDIA or the Property Council and others. So I guess, sorry, my question for you, Kylie, is are there other ways that we can win that argument? Where did we go wrong? What can we do to try and counter that narrative? And potentially for you too, Jessie. And then the second question for you, Kylie, is are going to be other mechanisms by which EDQ is going to encourage social and affordable housing, even if it's not necessarily with those particular mechanisms? I remember in my previous life, we were recipients of some of the competitive neutrality funding, for example. So are there other mechanisms by which you'll be doing that in the future?
Yeah, very good questions. I might answer the second one first. So we will always look for different mechanisms. Sometimes we've had mandatory requirements, sometimes we've had targets. I'm predominantly operating in the planning space, so what can we do from our planning controls to enable and facilitate housing, and how can we keep the cost of that housing to a minimum without compromising on all the other amenity elements and good quality neighbourhood outcomes we need to achieve, which is always very difficult. But in addition to that, while we may have taken out the mandatory requirements in development schemes and the Woolloongabba scheme, where it was set very, very high, it was set at 20% in the area of Woolloongabba where it was just not able to be delivered through the private sector. We had smaller, more moderate outcomes in the other two PDAs. We are delivering affordable product in those without them having to be subsidised. So I still think we will continue to look for mechanisms and see how we can deliver those through a planning framework. But distinct from that, Heather's group in particular is looking at how we can be involved in direct delivery through funding and through state land and facilitating development with our partners. From a planning perspective, what we do is we talk to the developers who come forward and talk about what could be leveraged out of this development outcome, and whether that's open space or whether it's a contribution towards significant infrastructure, hard infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, or whether it's some sort of type of housing supply that would have a broader benefit. We will always explore all those options.
Jessie, do you want to add anything to the private sector winning the argument based on increased costs and getting out of any affordable housing contributions?
Well, I think part of what we factored into the design of our proposed framework for mandatory inclusionary zoning, is grandfathering in plans that are coming down the pipeline. There's a sustained timeline so that it's not going to hit the market or the development sector in one shot, and that it phases in over time, over quite a bit of time, and just kind of reduces the impact and lets people, prepare for inclusionary zoning nationally. I think I've had a few people say, but why the word mandatory? Couldn't we soften that? And I think the word mandatory is really another word for consistency, like straight across the board, like right across the entire country. So everybody knows, what it is and that there's no variation on it.
I remember just before I left the UK, the affordable housing target in London was 50%. So one affordable for every one private. There was a hell of a lot of pushback on that. Even though, pretty profitable to develop on London, there are limits. Whereas up in Newcastle, where I used to live, it was about 5%. So all based on the economics. Okay, next question. Yeah. Just hang on a sec. He's on his way.
Hi, my name's Danielle. I'm from Housing Choices. I wanted to ask, at what point does community engagement or consultation, where do you call the line?
Do you mean call the line as in don't do it or do more? Or?
Well, no, as in how much say they have. It's about, I guess, educating as opposed to giving a yes or no call.
I mean, I'm not a community engagement expert. I've done quite a bit of community engagement, worked with some fantastic experts, and there are definitely the different ways to do it. So it's not just about, how much say they have, but it's about how they're also asked to have a say. I mean, I was involved in a deliberative engagement process a couple of years ago for a master plan for a public, for a boulevard through Melbourne, and so it was a very different process to, say, the sort of broad brush community engagement where it's just sort of have your say, here's some material online. This was actually a process where 30 members of the community were, everyone had to put in an EOI if they wanted to be on it, 30 members of the community then got involved, and then over a sort of 6 weeks period, different experts they could request experts, but different experts were also presented to them, and so the group met regularly, I think it was weekly, to sort of thrash out what they all supported in the design. And it was great because you had, older people in the community who had really nice apartments basically saying, I don't want to lose my car park, I don't want my friends to be able to park out the front. And you had younger people saying, I'm never going to be able to afford to buy a car, and we all cycle. And they had to thrash it out together, and it was an incredibly productive process. And I mean, there's another example of that in the city of Melbourne where they got a deliberative community engagement panel to help inform the budget. And at the beginning of the process, they sort of tracked different people's opinions along the way. So at the beginning of the process, I think like 90% of them were against a rate increase. And by the end of the process, 100% of them were for a rate increase because they were sort of exposed to different thinking along the way as well, able to ask their own questions at their own pace. And so when they were turning up saying we want more parks and all these things, but we don't want a rate increase, they were just sort of educated over 6 weeks about why that maths doesn't add up. And so once they realised, oh, our rates go to something valuable and we can have a say in what that looks like, it really shifted their perspective. And so it's unfortunately, I think community engagement, there was too often just, here's all some material, come to a town hall session or jump online or do this survey, and that's just not going to shift things. And so then the engagement programs that I've been involved like that, they start with a sense of fear from usually the government side too often, which is we don't want to hear bad news, so we won't give them, we don't invite that really rigorous, tougher conversations, or there's no space or no time. But this other one was interesting. It was far more cost effective because you actually had, but it was targeted because you relied on community reps rather than a broad brush. We have to email, 100,000 people or something, mail out 100,000 people. But it was really inclusive and really representative and really, really effective.
Can I just add something to that? I've been kind of struck by this study, and there's been follow-ups, but none as I think as strong as this study in 2012. They said that 47% of the population of Australia was functionally illiterate, and yet we keep sending functionally illiterate, like low literacy level, like really have a difficult time reading and writing, and we send things out in writing to people, and we expect them to understand it. And I think for the people who've got the most at stake, to kind of go back to your question, like we need to do everything that we can to get out in front of them to make sure that they understand and they're coming along the process and understand, like, from a broader perspective, like the implications for what we're talking about. And it does take time. It does take investment. We do see, more and more of the sector, prioritizing the people living in housing and putting more investment in time into community development, into community engagement, into comms and comm strategies to make sure that, not just that people get upset when they find out what happens or they go to Four Corners, but they're part of the process, and they support it.
I'm going to take a slightly different approach and say, so I've been doing planning and community engagement on planning documents for 30 years. There's always unders and overs in any community consultation process you undertake. However, generally, it's those that feel they're going to be negatively impacted that are the ones that take the time to come in and express their concern through community, on the ground community consultation or in writing. So once you get those submissions, and inevitably in a planning process, you prepare a submissions report that looks going to be about what they are losing personally. What is the personal impact on them? So from a planning perspective, and you need strong political support to do this, you need to put that in the context of the whole. So we've just done a community consultation process on 3 development schemes. You know, one of them got 137 submissions. Some of them positive because they were generally from the landowners in the development sector, and then there was the community, and they generally came through a pro forma. But it was about 70 people. I know that there's 3,500 people living in that community. So then you've got to put into the context, it's 70 people who have expressed concern. And what was their concern? Well, people from outside my suburb are coming in and parking in the street where I want to park my second car, because I didn't pay for the second car park within the development because I couldn't afford an extra $100,000 and still buy into this community. So you always have to put that in the context of what are they really concerned about, and how do we deal with the broader community and the future community when we're doing that planning consideration.
Here's another question over there.
Can I just respond to that? Is that all right? Because I find that not surprising, and I agree that reflects my experience a lot as well. I think what I think you're raising, which is really great, is the challenge with doing the consultation that way, isn't it? Because you're right, you actually draw out the negative people, you draw out the more self-interested. I'd just love to hear your thoughts then further about, well, how do you crack that? Like, and I think it is tied to this question of literacy as well. Like there was some great work done by the Hornery THI Institute about urban change based in Brisbane. I thought that was so great because a lot of people didn't even know change was coming, so they're not even triggered to get involved, or, like, how do we crack that? So, because I'm sure maybe I'm reading between the lines. From what you're saying, you could almost write the report before you do the consultation. So how do you crack that so we get more, like, shift in everything?
So excellent point. So THI were actually involved in our Wollongabba scheme 6 months ago. And before the scheme came out, they actually did community, they did community surveys. And the information was invaluable. Because what they did is they went out, this is already an area in transition, it's already getting very high densities, and there's already a lot of younger people moving into the area. So those people actually participated, and they gave really good feedback around, where we do want open space, but we want to get the traffic out, we want to achieve these things. And then when we went through formal consultation, the people who mainly made submissions through that process were the people who had particularly invested in detached housing in that area and felt that this area was changing from their detached housing to high density, and they gave completely opposite views. So what we were able to do when we briefed the minister in this case is saying, here was the results of the community engagement we did around the vision that we have for the area, and then these are the submissions from the development scheme from others. And we actually plotted them, who lived where and what were their comments, so that politically they were able to balance those competing interests. The other piece of work that I was involved in, which was back in 2013, we were looking at redoing the SEQ regional plan in Queensland, and what we knew was that there had been no engagement on the future development of southeast Queensland since the plan was done before that, which was 5 years previous. And we knew if we went out and just tried to engage coal with the community, they would still be telling us the same thing. We don't want density. We don't want that sort of development in our area. We don't want those sorts of people. And this was not about any sort of particular housing, it was just density. BCC had also received a whole lot of feedback on that. And we actually got, I can't remember who was a consultant, to try and benchmark around the world what was best community engagement. And they ended up in Canada, and it said it was about keeping the conversation with the community going all the time, not just waiting to consultation period. Particularly on something like a regional plan, you have to maintain that conversation with the community and community representatives, so that when you go back out and say, what are we going to achieve, there is informed people in the community that can lead the community conversation.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant.
Yeah, over there.
Hi, Adam from the City of Sydney Council. Thank you so much for the discussion so far. It's been really great. I do have 2 questions. The first one is, how is the panel defining affordable housing? Because 5 to 20% of market certainly wouldn't be affordable in Sydney. In the context of estate renewal projects, such as Hodyl, that proposes tripling of density with a social mix of 30% social, 20% affordable, how can we ensure that we build social cohesion in those communities? Because quite often we hear from, certainly in engagements around the Hodyl redevelopment, from tenants themselves, a great degree of anxiety or apprehension for being in such close proximity to private households due to lack of understanding. They're going to call the police on us all the time and the like. So, just keen to hear the panel's thoughts on those.
Kylie, do you want to talk about definition?
EDQ has a specific definition of affordable housing, and we were just talking about this before. We have always been of the position, from a planning perspective in EDQ, that we need a definition which is relevant to our policy outcome that we are seeking. But fundamentally, what we have acknowledged is that we need housing. When we're talking about affordable housing traditionally in our development schemes, it's housing that is affordable for low to moderate income households, because that was originally in our legislation back in 2007, and they had to pay no more than 30% of their income for rent or to purchase the house to make it affordable. So we have used that as our threshold, and that's generally where we've set a requirement or a target of 5% or 20% of the product as being affordable. We have used mandates, but in those cases it was quite small, moderate, so it was 5%. Where we have had higher outcomes for affordability, so 20%, we've set them as targets, and we've looked at the product type and said, how do we actually deliver affordable through design? So we looked at how to reduce the land size and the house size to actually make that come in as full market housing, but affordable to people who are within the moderate household. So we define that 50 to 120% of median income for that local government area. So we were generally dealing with people on $80,000 to $150,000 a year. What would be affordable for them to purchase or rent? Because it's very valid to have investors buying into that product. As long as it's affordable product in the general market, it will be made affordable to rent.
Can I talk to that second point? Just briefly?
Yep, go.
Chia, New South Wales, which is just outside, has a stand, just I think it's like second one in as you go around the bend, has been working on an international placemaking project for quite a while now. I think they're going into their third year, and that's a project in collaboration with the Housing Quality Network in the UK and Community Development in Australia, and they've been specifically focusing on estate renewal and how do you do it well. And a lot of the focus has been around like placemaking, around community development, around engagement. As you were saying, really spending the time, to go through the process so that, because people want connection, they want to know each other, and in doing that, you break down, the unknowns, the stigma, the othering, which often divides us. It takes more, and the reality is it's easier to divide, as we see, than it is to unify. It takes more time. And so we got to put the time in to bring the people together, to talk about, really define each other's like strengths and superpowers and to help bring them alive. Because what ultimately happens is, as Leanne was saying, they start being the advocate for the community themselves, and they start to support each other, and the concerns around the division do drift away.
Leanne, have you got any comments on the social cohesion side?
Oh, I was just going to answer the definition question first.
Yeah.
So in Victoria, it's tied to income levels, so it's defined by a defined lower income and housing that's affordable to that income level. But others work in it every day for me, so tell me if I've got that right. I don't work in it as much every day. But that's relatively recent. I think that came in 2017. Thank you, Tom. Although, just for your amusement, I did see a planning so we have now in the one of our fast track programs at the moment is the development facilitation program, and so a developer can jump into that program, which is run by the state government, put their permit application into that program if they deliver a certain threshold of affordable housing. So just for your amusement, one I read this week, it's student housing, private student housing, which of course is not affordable. They're arguing it's affordable housing because, and it's literally one sentence, clearly they're students, so they qualify and they mustn't have enough money. and yet it's private, it's one of these like escape projects or something, where the average rent is like $520 a week for a room. So yeah, hopefully that gets cut off.
Well, the private sector definition of affordable housing, if somebody bought it, it was affordable.
But just on the social cohesion one, I mean, there's obviously probably better experts in the room than me in this, but I think we've been looking at some of just the more like sort of design considerations of some of the mixed tenure developments, and just even some of the really practical things about where you position playgrounds or entrances, and or if there's communal space like communal kitchens and stuff, how do you just make sure they're located in really logical, inclusive ways, just so that they facilitate interaction where you want it, but also not where it's not wanted. So it's sort of trying to move any of the kind of points of tension or conflict, and just be really cognizant of just the reality of how people walk into a space, or what they can see from their space, or how they get to their own front door, and who they're interacting on the way. So it's got to be done in a very tangible way, I think, about what the experience of those places are.
All right, we'll take a question from this side, and then I'll come back over there, because I feel like I've been favouring the left. Yeah. It's on its way. And then...
Oh, sorry. Someone else.
Oh, sorry. Carry on.
Okay.
Go on.
I've got a question. Marie McKenzie from Homes North Community Housing. I've got a question for you, Kylie, around the schemes, and it appears you've been doing for quite some time. Have you gone back and done evaluations over time? Because, a lot of it's theory that we work on in planning and in the social, looking at social infrastructure, etc., and how we're going to develop these mixed tenure projects. I think it's very helpful to understand what's been the result of your evaluations, because it's only theory, and until we do it, we really don't know. We've got experience, we've got a lot of research that will tell us what will work, but as you know, it's the proof is in the actual development itself.
Can I just get a clarifying question? So when you say go back in and see what's being delivered, from what aspect?
Has it been successful? When you looked at all of what you wanted to achieve, you set down a whole series of outcomes, and the social cohesion, community acceptance, all the domains that you consider when you're doing that scheme, going back in and evaluating against all of those outcomes you were hoping to achieve, and what mitigation you put in place, did they work?
So of the 39 PDAs that have been declared, probably one has actually been finished, and we still haven't handed that back to council. And when I say finished, it means the development has been built out and all the objectives in the development scheme have been delivered. And yes, it was very successful. All the other ones are still tracking through development to various stages. Some of ours are very, very large, and they have a 40, 50, 60-year horizon. What we have done with some of our PDAs, probably earlier as opposed to in recent years, is there was a lot of analysis to go back to see what was actually tracking with the Affordable by Design product. In particular, there was a very substantial debate in Queensland probably about 2 or 3 years ago around the definition of affordable and what we meant by affordable. Could we get a consistent definition? And so what we did as a group in EDQ was we were going back and looking at second generation of sales of the houses in our PDAs that had been delivered as affordable product in the first instance, or what we suspected was affordable, because most of the contracts of sale were private and you couldn't see them. But we were looking at, our target was 25% of housing as affordable. So we were looking at second generation sales to see what they were selling at, to see whether they had maintained affordability for the cohort we were targeting, which is the 50 to 120% of median household income, and see whether they'd still be able to be afforded. And up until the end of 2022, they were still delivering. They were have the same borrowing capacity because we were factoring in the increase in housing interest rates plus a 3% APRA buffer, and that just meant that what people could borrow was substantially less, and it was actually putting what people could borrow against the housing product. They weren't meeting, they couldn't get that borrowing capacity. So we have done reviews like that. We also, in the early days with Fitzgibbon, which really sort of kicked off in 2010 with small product. Very controversial at the time. We don't want that small product here, but it did change the planning landscape in Queensland, and we now have a lot more smaller products. We have some products which are freehold tenure at 65 square metres, which is the house and land freehold. There was people in the community that were very concerned about that. We did do post-occupancy surveys of those people. It's been very, very popular. People love living in it. And the other trend that we picked up was where we thought it was going to be first homeowners and probably more investment product. What we did find, and this is probably going back to about 2015-16 now, is there was a lot of professional and young families living in that area who could only afford that product. They were living in that cheaper product, using it as a stepping stone for their second house. So it had been a very successful model. I think that what EDQ needs to do now is do more of that post-occupancy survey and look at other ways that we can also alter that housing product that is being delivered in PDAs to once again look at that affordability lens.
Right, can we just get the microphone up here? It almost made it last time. Just keep going. Just, all right, thanks.
Hello, it's Lisa Sampson. I'm with ACHIA, which is the peak body for Aboriginal community housing in New South Wales. My questions or commentary a little bit is really to the panel around the ability to work with the Aboriginal community housing provider sector. I haven't heard it once mentioned in this session. I'm a little concerned about it, given that, say, for example, in New South Wales, we've got many local Aboriginal land councils, Aboriginal community housing providers, prescribed body corporates that have had native title transfers back to them, the repatriation of stolen land, and these are the people with whom government can be doing business as opposed to with greedy private developers. This is a way of paying the rent. It is a way of aligning with organisations that already at their values base believe in mandatory inclusionary zoning. And I think when I loved the presentations that you all made, and yet I reflect on, say, for example, co-design in Copenhagen. Now, co-design is a central tenet of closing the gap. This is happening in Australia, and yet it's this big mystery, and oh God, what are Aboriginal people doing, and what do they want now? Well, if this is seen as such a fruitful part of what Copenhageners believe in and see as really fantastic for how they want to create their city and neighbourhoods being livable, how about that same kind of respect be afforded to our first Australians, so that modern design and development, in modern urban design and development, can pay that rent and repatriate what was lost, but also utilise the values that, Kylie, I loved hearing the fact of talking about going to families and saying, well, where do you want your children to live? Where do you want your single uncle to live, et cetera, because these are the kinds of values that Aboriginal families and their communities have been banging on about since invasion. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, at what level are the people that you speak to and the influence that you exert, at what level are they really breaking down the barriers of working with Aboriginal communities at a real level as opposed to only booking welcomes to country, so that it becomes real and we do pay the rent?
So let me start. There's a lot there. So while I understand that from a broader perspective, at Economic Development Queensland, we only work in very specific areas where a PDA has been declared. And while we work in areas where there have been native titles and there is native title claims, and I think about Waraba in Caboolture, very well aware of the Kabi people and their desire to live back into that community where they haven't lived for a long time. EDQ's role is around providing for that development to occur, from my perspective, when we're doing the planning. And we would love to be able to work with, Aboriginal community groups who are trying to, purchase housing and develop housing in an area. We are tenure blind with who is seeking to develop that land and for what purpose. We are about how do we facilitate that housing to respond to the needs of the community. Separate to that, EDQ does have a development role in certain locations. I can't speak to whether we have had any direct request from an Aboriginal community group or an Aboriginal group who are seeking to deliver housing as a direct outcome, but I can certainly see that EDQ has expertise that we could bring to the table to discuss with those groups. What are they seeking to achieve? Where are they seeking to achieve it? And how can EDQ offer some assistance in understanding the opportunities through the market to actually deliver that housing?
Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I can comment. I mean, it's really patchy, definitely in Victoria. Like, I'm not close to the treaty kind of work that's being done. I can only talk from my own professional perspective. But like great examples that I've seen start were somewhat ironically the Commonwealth Games, which obviously got abandoned. But we were working with the state government on that, and they knew they had to go really fast because they were struggling to meet the deadline, which obviously that has its own history now. But we ran sessions working with the 3 different traditional owner groups across the different locations, and so it was fantastic to work with. There were elders from like the Wathaurong and the Jattarong, and we knew how fast it was going to have to go, and so the person leading the state government work knew that she was going to have to get something in place quickly and something meaningful in place that would then help shape all the other development work that followed. And so she commissioned us to help put together a sort of charter, and we had such great, I think it had to be fast, but we had really great deep discussions, and I got called out constantly on my framing. I learnt so much through this process personally, and in the end, we ended up pulling together a charter where we had healing country at its core, and I was really proud of the work. And then it started to inform the early development work, where, for example, on one of the sites in Geelong, the architect just quickly put out a scheme, and then the first question we were able to ask them in a working session was, but how have you delivered on the healing country principles? Because you've just put development right on top of the creek. And I know that's not quite exactly what you're talking about in terms of working with the community housing providers, but I thought it was a really brilliant beginning, but of course it didn't go anywhere because the games got there. But then on a more day-to-day level, most of the work that I'm working on is trying to get things like policy in place, like inclusionary zoning, mandatory zoning, which would have a flow-on effect to working with a lot of community housing providers. But I think your points. I think it's a really great thing that you've raised, because we're not doing it very well. And you're right, it's not foregrounded enough. And I think that we can definitely do it better. It's definitely not happening in the activity centre program. And I think that it's something that it's a good reminder to me too, to remember that Commonwealth Games experience and how much we have got the opportunity to foreground it.
Hi, Lisa. I think that power sharing and co-design takes time and takes really good facilitation and like willingness to listen and invest, to arrive at the outcome that we're all after. And I'm not really sure who's doing it really well, except to say that I do look at these DSS Stronger People, Stronger Places portfolio locations, and they seem to be doing a good job with, the local Aboriginal community leading, the development and the placemaking work that's going on. And obviously some do it better than others, but I think there's an opportunity to learn, from some of the outcomes that we're seeing come through these 10 sites across Australia. And there's a few people who are here at Hodyl today who represent those sites, and they're worth, it's worth talking to them about, like, how can we do it differently? Like, how can we work with the Aboriginal community so they can lead, and really help us get to that place.
We've got time for a couple more. Gentleman at the back.
Hi, my name's Andrew McAnulty. I'm the CEO of Link Wentworth, a community housing provider in Sydney, and we're very proudly the lead CHP on Waterloo. It's been mentioned a few times, and we're working with City West Housing and Birribee Housing, a First Nations community housing provider. So I've talked to a number of people about Waterloo in the last day or so, and happy to do so over the rest of the conference. But I just wanted to pose an opportunity and a challenge to the panel. I'm a big fan of inclusionary zoning, originally from London about 20 years ago. But I think now one of the big challenges is in many bits of Sydney, and I think from what I'm hearing around Australia, build cost is more than value. So it's not the time for cross-subsidy because really there's a stifling of any construction activity. And I can see some brilliant planning work going on around the state and the country, but it seems to be developers pushing to optimise their future development potential of the sites, but not the current delivery potential of the sites. So I think what I'm posing really is an opportunity around, we've got this once in a generation, unless we deliver and prove it's successful, of the Housing Australia Future Fund, and we need to get a pipeline of sites and layer funding. So I think some of the brilliant planning work almost needs to be tipped, and as you were saying, Kylie, particularly around some of the delivery, activating the delivery, where maybe developers are putting forward some of the land, 10 or 20% of the land early, and that you create a pipeline through the local CHP, whereby they layer the various funding to deliver the social and affordable housing early, and let the market housing follow it when the economic reality is right. But I think that land economic element that was discussed in the earlier session needs to come on board. So I'm posing, what do you think the opportunity is to put the social and affordable housing first by layering subsidies to capture this moment in time?
That's a lot of the work that's going on right now inside of the SGS economic modeling framework project. And we're looking at like where we embed the economics around MIS and timing, especially in relation to the developers and the developers and the land owners, bankers, whatever you want to refer to their position as. So that they frame it and they get their mind around what they're investing in, and that MIS is going to be part of that development, and what those return rates on land value look like. And I do attend those sessions, but I'm not the economics subject matter expert on it. But those conversations are alive and happening right now, Andrew. And we do have a MIS steering committee, which one of your friends is a part of, and a few of your friends might be actually a part of, and happy to chat with you more around that beyond this discussion.
I think that's a very hard question for me personally to answer. Not being on the development side, but more on the planning side in the first instance. So I'm sure there's some of my development colleagues in EDQ could probably give you a much better answer. To me, using, I suppose, the affordable and even social housing component to leverage the financing to get development up and going sounds like an excellent idea. I suspect it will very strongly be influenced by the product type. Because if you're looking, for example, in Woolloongabba, where 30, 40, 50-storey development, I'm not sure that component, even at 20%, would be enough to leverage the financing required to get that development away. Where you have more moderate development, there may be that as an opportunity. I also noted, and Leanne said this earlier, we have two different sorts of developers out there. Those that are speculating and trying to drive down the requirements on their land to maximise its value to sell it to somebody else, which will make it harder for that developer then to deliver the product on the ground because they've had such a huge price for the land. And then those that are actually delivering today, and they are the ones that are probably also more reasonably looking at, well, what is the affordable component of this product, because they need to maximise the number of people that are going to invest in their product. So they have to have as big a market as they can. And while obviously the cream on the top the cream comes with those very expensive units, they need all the units to be sold to get that financing if they're doing the traditional model. So for them, it's really beneficial to have some units that are very moderate and affordable, and then obviously some that are really expensive. But when we get really big developments such as Willendaver, it's really hard to get that going at the 40 or 50 stories. And we also have a lot of those developers that are speculating and trying to just maximise value. I think the way that you could look at doing this, and this is, I'll just caveat this is not a Queensland government policy, just based on my experience, and this is what we did in Bowen Hills and North Shore back in 2008, was you bring in the requirements and you say they will kick in after this period. So then it gets the people who are really about developing now and contributing to supply and product, and those that are holding, it allows time for the land value to normalise and factor in that potential cost.
All right, we've got time for one very quick question. I think the gentleman will be very patient at the back there.
Hi there, thank you. Matthew Crosley from National Affordable Housing. Quick one. How do we overcome the challenge of NIMBYism, particularly around high density? And I live in inner city Brisbane, and I think yourself, Kylie, Bowen Hills, North Shore, delivering a lot of housing stock, but you've got councillors, politicians, community groups creating outrage, creating angst, but at the same time saying we need more housing. How do we overcome that?
In 1 minute.
You just got to keep having the conversation, because what we say is those people, particularly the people with the problem, they won't be here forever, and younger people will come up and they'll have a different attitude if that's always been the conversation they've heard.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, we've touched on it already, I think continue to build literacy around what good looks like, because I think it's easy for the negative vocal people to say no to something, and if it comes online it's not very good, they get a kind of following as well. But I think we actually need to get more engaged community members, so actually not just the NIMBYs, but actually what they informing conversation about what good looks like and what they actually want to see in their community.
Any final thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you so much to our three fantastic presenters. Give them a round of applause. Thank you for attending the session. I believe we now have afternoon tea in the same location as the previous food. And at 4 o'clock, we've got the final plenary session of the day talking about housing supply. So thank you very much.